Hi everyone, my name is Honor Harger and I'm the Executive Director of ArtScience Museum in Singapore. I'd like to welcome you for today's panel discussion with Scott Smith, the latest speaker in our online talk series, Feeling the Future. Shortly, Scott's going to be joining me for a Q&A, which relates to the talk that we've just uploaded to the ArtScience Museum website. We're live on YouTube and we're very happy to take questions from you for today's Q&A. If you've got questions, please write them in the comments of the YouTube stream, and our production team will pick them up and relay them to us as we go along. So before I welcome Scott Smith, I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction and some context. Scott Smith's talk is part of ArtScience Museum's new online program, which is called ArtScience at Home. It's presenting online versions of our education activities, such as exhibition tours and educational workshops, as well as our flagship public programs, including performances, talks, and screenings. Now, here in Singapore, as we all know, as well as many other countries around the world, museums such as ours are closed due to the impact of COVID-19. Our visitors here and around the world are at home, working and taking care of their families. So for us, ArtScience at Home is now our primary program and a vital way for us to connect with existing audiences, as well as welcoming new audiences from around the world. It enables us to continue to present programs and stories that show what happens at the intersection of art, science, culture, and technology. So we think ArtScience at Home is an exciting new chapter in ArtScience Museum's evolution and perhaps an expression of a more resilient and sustainable way of working during this new pandemic era that we find ourselves within. The first of our online conferences for ArtScience at Home is called Feeling the Future. It consists of a series of online talks taking place over several weeks, featuring speakers who examine the human capacity to imagine new futures in a world where uncertainty and anxiety are now dominant. This is programming for the pandemic era, as we ask local and international experts to address topical issues raised by COVID-19, ranging from emotional courage and mental health to social resilience to medical ethics. We had originally intended that Feeling the Future would be a conference that would run alongside our exhibition 2219, Futures Imagined, within the museum itself. That show explores a set of possible futures for Singapore, which are shaped by the impact of climate change. But as COVID-19 hit, it became natural to pivot the conference and refocus it around urgent and timely responses to a situation that's changed the nature of the future for everyone, whether they're in Singapore or anywhere else. Some of the other speakers in the Feeling for the Future series include Ariel Muller from Forum for the Future, who spoke a couple of weeks ago, Cheryl Chung from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here, who will be speaking kind of in a couple of weeks, Tong Yi from the Thought Collective here in Singapore, and of course today's speaker, Scott Smith, whose talk just went live on our website an hour ago. His talk shares some practical tools for mapping out possible futures during a crisis. So at this juncture, I'd like to welcome Scott Smith and introduce him to the chat. Scott's been a practicing futurist for more than 25 years. He's the co-founder of Changeist, where he leads strategy, research and design activities. And he's currently based in The Hague in the Netherlands, where he's joining us today. So please welcome Scott Smith. Hi, Scott, how are you doing?
Hi, Honor. I'm doing well, thank you. It's super to be here with you. I'm really happy to be here.
So we're thrilled that you're able to join us and speak to the audience, and also thank you for the talk that you've shared, which is a really practical primer, I think, on tools and techniques which are so valuable for this moment. I wonder if you can kick us off by saying a few words about what you do at Changeist and what a futures agency like yours works on a day-to-day basis.
That's a really good question. Changeist, I guess if you really boil it down, we try to help organizations, help people make sense of complex futures. And the future, can seem quite sort of stable and smooth one day. And of course, we look out the window this morning and we have a hard time seeing 5 minutes ahead. So we kind of act as a signal observatory, taking in information, things that we think are indicators of possible change and directions that things might go in the future. We help organizations find intelligent ways of making sense of that and mapping that to then be able to tell stories that are substantial enough that they can make decisions around them, to create a narrative, and then to engage other people, to engage the public or people inside an organization with an idea about the future, to discuss it, debate it, and to make decisions on it.
And how do you do that? Kind of what are some of the ways that, kind of a sort of a small agile futures agency like Changeist, what are some of the kind of the ways that you perform that work?
I think the first really important element is to work with very smart, very sensitive people who are kind of attuned to their environments and are paying attention to a really wide range of areas around the world, topics, sectors, regions, etc. We try to bring together a lot of bright minds who are curious and wired to be asking questions. And then find ways to frame those questions, whether it's through something that looks and feels a bit more like traditional strategy, or probably on the other end of the scale, something that looks and feels like art or fiction. Finding the kind of, we sort of churn every day to look for different metaphors, different methods, different boxes to put ideas about the future in, to make them accessible to other people. So that involves a lot of research, experimentation, a lot of internal discussion and kind of sense making of our own. And then trying to find kind of new and different ways to break through the noise and actually reach people with important ideas so that they can pick them up, find a handle on them, and engage with them in a tangible way.
And, in terms of how that might manifest, would that range from events, workshops, publication? What are some of the kind of outputs of that type of work?
A lot of our work is it's sort of like an iceberg. A lot of it sits below the surface, that in particular because organizations might be talking about things that are very sensitive or exposing a lot of internal uncertainties. A lot of the work we do tends to kind of sit just out of sight. But I think some of the most interesting work we do tends to find its way into things that may look like a museum exhibition, where we're actually creating artifacts and or working with artists to create artifacts to engage the public or certain groups with. We write quite a lot, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and try to frame ideas for people. We have kind of a intermittent podcast where we share our own kind of internal conversations with the world. Sometimes we run small events, and a lot of what we're doing lately is centered around a book that we wrote over the course of the past year that will be coming out in September, that tries to condense and explain how we do our own thinking and engage other people with that so that they can take it on themselves. What's
the book called?
The book is called How to Future. Might as well keep it really compact and simple. It's called How to Future.
Well, in a way, you've sort of segued quite nicely into the next question, which is the topic of your talk. I'm hopeful that at least some of the people who are tuning in now have had a chance to have a look at the talk. It's currently at the ArtScience at Home website. But for those who may not have had a chance, I wonder if you could just give a quick top-level précis about why you wanted to speak about the topic of making maps for change, and what some of the kind of key points were.
Sure. It kind of sits, I guess, in between a couple of different issues. One was the book is, I said, kind of a way of condensing and kind of making accessible some of the very simple models or frameworks or kind of tools or methods that we use in our own professional work to take really complex and often very fuzzy and uncertain situations and start to cut them down into small pieces and to map them in ways that we can understand them. And this became really relevant in the kind of outbreak of COVID. And by the middle of March, I think, there was a general kind of scramble as everyone kind of ducked for cover, but was having a really difficult time understanding what was happening, why it was happening, and most importantly, what might happen next. Sometimes we talk about the future being elastic. Sometimes we have the luxury of looking at a 10-year or 20-year horizon. Suddenly we were looking at next week, next month, 6 months from now. And not just in a professional way, but very much in a personal way. So I felt kind of compelled on a Sunday morning to quickly write a kind of short article trying to speak very plainly about ways that people could begin to take some simple steps and map just the next couple of phases forward, enough to begin to make some sense. Maybe not have the exact prediction, because that's not what we're after, but to establish some clarity. And so we use a tool called Futures Wheels or Impact Wheels, depending on where you learn them. And they're a very basic paper and pen way of working out if there's a significant change, something like suddenly everyone's working from home or we're no longer flying. Those are major changes. Working out in first order and second order impacts, what might happen next, so that you start to get a bigger picture and the resolution becomes a little bit clearer. And you can begin to anticipate what some of the next steps might be, whether to adjust to them, to plan for them, to stock up for them, to make other decisions based on them. And I think it's really important for people not to sort of struggle with getting a picture of the perfect outcome in 3 or 5 years, but for most of us is to focus on what's going to happen in the next few weeks or months. And even today, we can see that changes every 12 hours.
So one of the things that really struck me when I was watching your talk was also, remembering the few occasions that, myself as very much an outsider, I guess, to the kind of futures and foresight process, have engaged in that exercise of trying to imagine, different impacts which are caused by specific events, whether they're crises or simply kind of social developments. And it struck me when I was engaged in those processes in the past that the tool is often almost a kind of a mental trigger for you to simply guess and imagine, kind of possible impacts. And I wonder whether or not there's more science involved, kind of than that, or whether a lot of this is, about crafting carefully worded questions that almost suggest, kind of specific outcomes.
It's really, it can be both. It can be both. And depending on what your kind of, to use a fancy term, your decision heuristics are, if you're in a situation where you need more sort of semi-scientific structured ways of looking at things, there's plenty of tools for doing that. But often what we really need is a kind of prosthetic for thinking. We need a little bit of a scaffold on the outside of our brains to help us think through questions in a sufficiently structured way that it helps us get through those steps. I think about it as kind of reverse archaeology in a way. If you've ever seen an archaeological dig, the researchers will go out and they'll draw a grid and they'll lay their chalk lines down and they'll begin to dig in individual sections of that grid. They don't come out with a JCB and start digging up the entire pyramid or whatever it is. They carefully excavate pieces of it so that they have a structure and they can see if a pattern begins to emerge. Do we have a house here? Is it a shop? Is it a temple? It's really kind of the same in reverse. And I used a couple of metaphors in the talk. One is the archive. An archive or a sort of historical archive is a sufficiently structured way of organizing the past, so we can find things and make sense of it. And, the next piece was a train schedule. That's a sufficiently structured, indicator of what's happening next. this train leaves this track at this time. So I think sometimes we just need that little extra structure to help us find the right questions and find out what we know, what we don't know.
And speaking of the right questions, just a reminder, we're live on ArtScience at Home on YouTube, and we are taking questions from anyone that's listening to us now. We're very, very happy to hear your feedback or questions. If you've got something that you'd like us to respond to, just write in the comments of the YouTube stream, and we'll pick them up and we'll address them straight away. So those practical tools that you very generously introduced us to in the talk, Scott, I'm guessing that they should, if they work correctly, give professionals in foresight, such as yourself, some capacity to be able to spot major changes on the horizon, and perhaps adapt a little more quickly than kind of those of us who may not have access to those kinds of tools can. So I guess my question is, did those techniques and tools help you identify the threat of COVID-19 earlier? And at what point did you start feeling that this was going to be extremely serious from a social, economic, and obviously medical perspective?
Since we spend a lot of time with those tools, they're often kind of ingrained as habits of mind. They become almost a kind of invisible way of thinking. We internalize them. And the sensing piece that I mentioned earlier, kind of being a signal observatory, that's very much a sort of habit of mind for all of us in the group and many of our colleagues that we work with. So you get in the habit of reading the small print, the small section below the fold, and in the morning, we probably spend an hour, each of us, going through various news sites. And I remember on January 6th coming across the small item, mysterious virus appears in Wuhan, China, researchers concerned, something to that effect. And it was in the New York Times. I mean, it wasn't hidden away in a scientific journal. It was, below the fold on the front page of one of the world's leading newspapers. But also, history tells us, particularly, in your region, what the possible transmission vectors can be, how important a center like the kind of industrial base of China is for travel, what we do and don't know about these things. And so that's the kind of item that immediately triggered some thought. And I posted it to a couple of different groups of colleagues, and we started discussing it. What do you think about this? Well, Chinese New Year is just around the corner. The entire nation's going to be traveling. There are a lot of other things that we already know that we could put with that and realize that there's a bit of a flashing red light there, and this bears paying attention to. We don't try to predict the outcome from that initial signal, but it says to us, keep watching, and also, as someone who travels internationally, start thinking about your own personal and professional activities and imagine how others might respond. So those kind of activities of asking, well, if this occurs, then what? If we start interrupting travel, then how does that change meetings? If you start, if we start kind of breaking up the supply chains, how does that affect business? Simple questions, really, in a way, but you can begin to take those items and peel them back. So we actually adapted, I think, quite early on. We started considering how we would change much of our face-to-face interaction, how the team would, fortunately, we're a virtual team for the most part, so we communicate this way anyway. But it gave us pause to consider how would we deal with this if it escalates.
And there's a certain sort of almost whiplash, I think one of your colleagues referred to it as, in sort of getting ready for that impact, and then the rest of the population sort of experiencing it 2 months late, 3 months later. Where you do feel you've sort of been waving the warnings for quite some time.
Well, and I think that's where you have to kind of manage yourself emotionally a little bit, but also understand where you might sit as someone who spends their life doing this versus the general public, or even professionals, and realize there are a lot of other mitigating decisions happening, down the chain. So people don't always respond rationally to information.
Yes.
Otherwise, economics models would always work, and they generally don't match the real world. So you have to consider a human element in that, as well as understanding bureaucracies and different cultural responses to things, different historical responses. All of those things kind of come into play there.
And that, I think introduces the first question that we've got from the floor really beautifully. This is from Nina Ernst, who asks makes the comment that she's found the current experience characterized by feeling uncertain, anxious, perhaps, about not even knowing the shape of the future. So how might your practical approaches against, almost sort of guard against that kind of emotional chaos? Can you always sort of think your way out of a crisis?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I think it would be it's kind of foolish to believe that you have a kind of scientific model that can guard you from the emotional impacts of crisis or even uncertainty. It's all about sort of fit for purpose, and can you have enough of a sort of framework, of a basic scaffold that gives you something to pull up on when uncertainty happens, when you begin to kind of respond from an emotional place. I think it's also really important in this particular situation to recognize that people have emotional responses to the future, and that's and to pictures of the future or to images of uncertainty, those are really important to understand and to connect with and to grapple with. But I think it's also in the same way that you have certain steps you might take if your house is on fire. If you smell smoke, do this. Or if someone's choking, here's 3 steps for response. It helps to become familiar with it so you can internalize a little bit some of these structures and have a bit of muscle memory in the same way we might train for sports, or you rehearse for a legal case. You always are kind of going through the motions a little bit. Even the big, organizations like Shell or, that in kind of developed scenario thinking, they did it in part to pre-rehearse what they might do in a situation so that when it came, they weren't making purely emotional decisions or purely business decisions, but taking into account a lot of these things and preparing themselves to engage with that complexity when it arrives.
Yeah, it's something that the artist group Foam call prehearsal, which is such a valuable process to almost sort of learn your emotional response to something. Speaking of artist groups, we've got a question from Amita, who asks about the experience that you mentioned of working with artists within Changeist, and what would be your opinion on the sort of special insight that artists might be able to provide in a futures process, or a particular kind of angle that kind of you would consider to be specific or valuable?
Sure. I think one of the things that kind of struck me early on, and this goes back probably 15 years or so, when I first started working with design teams and artists and people with different crafts backgrounds, and trying to find ways to materialize and to create a picture or a model of a future to engage other people with, is that it's an incredibly powerful way to get through to both our emotional responses and kind of deeper level engagement. Back to the question from Nina, the idea that you should only engage with these things on a rational basis is flawed. You have to find a balance between the rational and the emotional. That's who we are as humans. And I think artists are great to engage with, to try to find those touch points and the triggers that can help people connect to an idea about the future. The 2219 exhibition that I was fortunate enough to be there for the open for does that in a brilliant way. Fantastic curation helps that, because it helps you understand that there's not just one way of engaging with an idea about the future. There are very complex narratives, and some people like those, and sometimes it's an emotional sensation, and you want to kind of pre-experience the emotions of being in a particular future to understand better how you would deal with it. And I think that's something that art and design have really brought to this practice that is tremendously valuable.
I mean, yeah, you're right. And this is certainly one of the guiding principles that we had when we were putting 2219 Futures Imagined together, to try and include kind of artistic versions of what Stuart Candy would call experiential futures, scenarios that, you know, perhaps previously would have been written up in the form of a report, made real into a physical environment that people could step inside and kind of live within for a period of time. And that definitely, I think, is something that happens, you know, when you're embodied kind of into that future scenario, that changes the way that you process the information compared to if you're reading it, which inevitably perhaps lends itself to a more kind of cognitive analysis.
Right, because at the end of it, we engage with the future on a human scale, right? It's us, and so you have to find those different representations that allow people to engage with it on their terms, and to understand how they will respond to it or anticipate it on their terms.
So we've got another question from YouTube. This one's from Garrett Sheridan, who asks, in a world of information overload and limited time, how do you decide what to focus on?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I think, in particular for those of us who were kind of naturally drawn to this work, your curiosity and your sort of interest can really overwhelm you sometimes. And I think finding some good practices for sort of keeping a little bit of distance, also being able to sort of see a pattern above noise. You know, often we're reading the very fine print, as I was saying earlier, and kind of scrolling to the bottom of the feed, if there is one, and looking for small bits of information, and that can become quite overwhelming. Yeah. But having a sort of, I almost want to say a system or a kind of notion of how you organize information in your mind and in your life can be useful to start to break all of that down into manageable pieces. You want to be able to stay with the weak signals and keep paying attention to things that you think are meaningful but don't quite have a shape yet, and yet also be able to shift onto new topics or process contrary information at the same time. Part of that comes through practice, but also, you know, the web is full of wonderful tools for kind of harnessing that fire hose, sorting it into some top line categories that you can begin to dig down into. But in the end, it really comes down to kind of time and management of your own focus. I give up a lot of other things that I probably could be doing, like reading books for enjoyment, to just kind of stay with one toe in the flow and keep up with what's going on.
So we've got one final question, and it's from Foam, who we were speaking about earlier. And they ask, for those who might not have a background in futures, and I'm guessing that's probably most of the people tuned in on the stream here, can you maybe dig down a little bit in a little bit more detail about how you decide to put something on that map? The map that you talked about in your talk, and what to leave off the map. What kind of impacts are considered here, and how does that help with the dynamic change and you know, the unexpected impacts?
Well, like anything else, it's an iterative process. It's something that is great to practice with, in part because you almost never get it right the first time, and there is no right. I think, which is kind of where the question's pointed, is there what you're really looking for to frame a map well, is to start with a significant change, something that's going to be very different. If it's a kind of, you know, small detail or something that's almost too abstract, then it's very difficult to peel back and kind of dig down into. So we try to focus on where is there something that's going to be very different. In the case of the example I gave, it was a current moment, but one that's sort of unresolved. Everyone's working from home. But it might be something like, you know, only certain people can travel in the near future. or we are never really able to interact in large crowds again, or all private vehicles will be self-driving, some significant change that you're unfamiliar with. And then being able to kind of work your way across a little matrix of asking about the social impacts and the technological impacts and the economic and the regulatory impacts on people's values, so that you don't just either try to solve the problem or just give technological impacts. But the question's really smart. It's the issue of what's left off and what's there. But the more you do it, and luckily, paper or an iPad or a Post-it note's fairly low cost in terms of writing something and erasing and trying again. Getting in the practice of thinking in those sorts of maps is really kind of the exercise itself. But you'll also be able to begin to see potentially interesting connections at the outer edges that you hadn't seen before. And that's really what the goal is. It's not to get 4 or 5 branches of predictions, but to uncover unconnected realizations, and to start to ask what do we don't know out here on the sort of further edge of the map.
And I guess it also, kind of alludes in a subtle fashion to who is part of the futuring process, and kind of who is futuring for, and who's not part of the process, and kind of who's not invited to the table, and of course that's probably one of the kind of primary sort of challenges, I guess, in the field, and something we could talk about for probably the whole day.
Well, I mean, if you read the article on the post on Medium that this all came from, there's a very clear signal of flag. If everyone at the table doing this with you looks like you, stop. Go find someone else. Call someone else. FaceTime someone else that's not like you, so that you can explore this future from different angles, not simply from a sort of monocultural, solutions-based kind of mindset.
Yeah, because otherwise you end up, kind of for foresight for the things that you're choosing to see, as opposed to the things that are just outside and in your blind spots.
Right.
Well, I think we are out of time. That half an hour kind of flew past. But thank you, Scott, so much for joining us today from the Netherlands, and for anchoring the second part of the Feeling the Future online conference. It was really great to have you here. I hope we're able to welcome you back to Singapore at some point in the near future. To all of you who have been tuning in to the live stream, thank you for joining us today. This is the first online conference that ArtScience Museum has produced. And it continues over the next few weeks. Our next speaker will be the fellow foresight professional, Cheryl Chung, from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here in Singapore. And she's going to pick up precisely where we left off with Scott, to talk about who's involved in these futuring processes, and speak in more depth about accessibility and inclusivity. We've got other exciting speakers in the program lined up throughout the period of June and July. So we hope to be able to welcome you back. We love getting your questions. In the meantime, stay safe at home, and we'll see you back for the next program in Art Science at Home. Thank you very much.
Thank you.